Good morning. Thanks for having me. I don't know how you must feel about a young millennial woman who's not formally theologically trained coming and talking about disruptive innovation today. I don't know, that might feel a bit disruptive. But the thing, yeah. But the thing I want you to know first and foremost, is what I believe about what disruptive innovation is, or holy disruption, maybe, might be an easier way to say it. Maybe holy disruptive innovation, or as a pastor friend from Houston says, disruptive hope. It's that I believe that the perfect example of this is Jesus Christ, who wasn't disrupting for disruption's sake, but to point to a coming kingdom that looks much different than the earth on which he walked, and looked much different than systems people had created. So please hear that first and foremost as you listen today, that is what I believe, and that is who I'm inspired by. So my background is in advertising and PR, and I work for the Baptist General Convention of Texas, by the way. Some of you in here I haven't met, but I work for the convention, and my background is in ad and PR. I remember working on a campaign for Taco Cabana right here in San Antonio, and and I love TC. I get tacos there regularly, but I remember sitting there working on this campaign thinking, there's got to be more, right? So that began a new trajectory for me, and I began to explore what working for churches could look like. With my skill set, I began working for the convention inside the communications department. By the way, if there's any place that you want to understand the inner workings of an organization best, it's the communications department. Maybe second best would be the executive offices, but for sure the communications department. And I remember sitting there in the convention at my cubicle, working on brochures and web pages for the programs that we were doing. And as important as I think that role is, and I'm saying that because my previous boss could watch this at some point, who I love and respect dearly, but in doing that I said, isn't there more to this too? Because it felt like there were some unanswered questions that churches were facing in communities across the state. Some big, overarching, unanswered questions. And I only know that because I heard that from many pastors of things that were happening inside of their communities that were shifting the way that they were needing to think about what it meant to express church in their neighborhoods and communities for people to engage with it. And those were some big questions, and those were sitting heavy with me. In the middle of all of those thoughts, which was a spiritual journey as well, it wasn't just a vocational or career journey. It was a spiritual journey for me. Dr. Hartage ended up approaching me about becoming his executive assistant, and I was really excited about the potential of that role, but I had one request, is that he would teach me how to lead, that it wouldn't just be a clerical job, but that he would teach me how to lead, and how to lead an organization that is like the BGCT, a network of churches, a network of pastors working together for something even greater than they could do on their own. I want to learn how to lead inside of that. So I'm going to put a pin right there in that story, and we'll come back to it. So I'm going to start today, in talking about disruptive innovation, start with the business theory bit of it. It might feel a little sterile, but I hope it's interesting to you, and some of these examples might help ground the concept. But then what we're going to do at the end is we're going to then begin applying that to theological and ecclesial points, theological and ecclesial applications of how we take this theory and apply it in that way, or how we can begin at least holding the proper questions to engage with it in that way, in a healthy way. So I'll land a definition for us, a description of a disruptive innovation. Our culture is fascinated with underdogs and overnight successes, companies, products, and services that seem to rise out of nowhere, right? That's interesting to us. The business world has created a theory around this phenomena, and it's called disruptive innovation. In business theory, a disruptive innovation is an innovation that creates a new market A new market, meaning a new group of people that it's reaching, and a new value network. And I'll define that for you too. A value network is a set of connections between organizations and individuals, interacting with each other to benefit the entire group. That's a really formal way of saying relationships and how people function together like a family instead of in isolation. Sounds like the church a little bit. But disruptive innovation, it eventually disrupts an existing market, and it disrupts an existing value network, displacing established market-leading organizations and products. It begins displacing those things. When Clayton Christensen from the Harvard Business School coined the term disruptive innovation, he wasn't just speaking of breakthrough innovations that make good products better. Innovations are constantly occurring in industry, but to be truly disruptive, an innovation must entirely transform a product or solution that historically was so complicated, only a few people with a lot of money and skills had access to it. So something had to be completely and truly transformed, and that previously only a select group of people had access to it. A disruptive innovation is often a much more simple, low-grade solution that's more affordable and accessible to a larger population. What happens then is it opens up an entirely new market, because all of a sudden people who couldn't afford something or have access to something have access to it for the first time. It's something that they viewed through a window that they now live into. This often upturns established industries and overthrows existing market leaders. Disruptive innovations typically take hold at the bottom of the market, not up here, right, at the bottom, meeting the same needs as high market solutions, but in a simple and relatively cheap way. It's usually simple, easy to understand, and something people can grasp, the everyday person can grasp. They are usually underrated at first and tend to be seen as low class, but due to their low costs and other advantages, they move quickly up the market and eventually become more appealing than their competitors. Christensen noticed that big, powerful companies at the peak of their power, though, they aren't asleep at the wheel. As they are driven out by disruptors, they're still moving forward. They're usually innovating away themselves. But these established companies drive what's called sustaining innovations, which are modifications and improvements on existing services. Tweaks here and there to something that already exists for a market that they already know really, really well. So in order to serve their most sophisticated and demanding customers, they just continue to tweak and make things more available to the same group of people. And it's driven by what they see as success, how they would define success, and what they measure, which is profit margin. And so they increase profit margin most by serving their most sophisticated and demanding customers continuously and sometimes exclusively and only into perpetuity. They're usually not bothered by disruptors because they appear to be low tier and low gross margin. They're not threatened by them. But this oversight creates space to creep up market and affect larger competitors. I want to take an aside right here and talk about the church just a little bit. I want to pause and talk about traditional church models, because what I want you to know, and especially as a young person, I think it's been assumed upon me or projected upon me that I want to throw the baby out with bathwater. I prefer traditional worship. I go to a traditional church and I love it, and it feels really, really good there. I think the new relies on the old. I think the new is just a new expression of the old sometimes. Sometimes in a radical way, but it's a new expression of the old. The danger is the churches, and I've seen this, who innovate out of chaos. And there's a difference between saving out of chaos or out of a threat of closing doors or out of a threat of a neighborhood or a community who doesn't trust you anymore, who doesn't want to be part of what you're providing, who maybe even ridicules you. That's chaos. It's chaotic. Your budget is going nuts. Your people might be in conflict with one another. There's difference, though, in saving out of chaos and co-creating out of chaos. And I think that we can co-create out of chaos. We don't just have to save out of it. So I'm going to give some aside finish. We're going to now move into examples. Let's go back to the business theory. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. The first one is personal computers. Some of you in this room have a better understanding of this than I do, and because you have lived it. So I get it. My dad just walked in the back, and so he can tell you, I have only grown up in a home with a computer. I don't know a home without one. So some of you might know this better than I. But just as smartphones have disrupted laptops and personal computers once disrupted earlier computing processors like the mainframe computer. I've only seen a picture of a mainframe computer, but you may have only seen a picture of a mainframe computer too, because according to Christensen, right, well, it was the first manifestation of digital technology, but it was powerful, but cost tons of money, required high skill. Only large corporations and universities were able to access them, and they cost several $1 million. So probably, even if you were living in a time when mainframe computers were a reality, you have also maybe only seen a picture of that. It was just something only an elite group of people had access to and could use. Many computers, many as in MINI, computers followed that, and eventually the desktop computer was invented. This could be in your home. Changed a market, right? With adaptations, then the laptop and smartphones took over technology. All of a sudden, the market for computers was massive. It exploded. So many people could access this, not just for an elite centralized market. But in that same way, right, the value system changed because the way people could relate and connect changed, and it's constantly changing. So we see a huge disruption to what was old computing software. Christensen said it was very hard for the pioneers of the industry to catch these new waves. Most of those were created and dominated by new companies. They just couldn't keep up. The second example I'll give you is video streaming. Video streaming took the entertainment industry completely by surprise, quickly rising from the bottom of the market as a low-cost way for people to watch shows and movies to eventually disrupting the cable industry and driving video rental stores into the ground. Netflix has become the largest subscription video provider in the US, outstripping cable and satellite. And it's not just cable and stores. Video streaming companies are changing the way video is produced. Nearly 2 decades after Netflix's launch, streaming providers are out to capture the entire $1 trillion Hollywood ecosystem with new content production models. Tech giants like Amazon and Google and Apple won in on the game in their own production streaming platforms as well. Like many disruptors, Netflix took hold in a small niche market. They started with movie buffs who didn't care about the new releases that were coming out and having access to them. They didn't mind waiting for a few days to get a DVD in the mail. Their service was slow and didn't offer brand new hits right away. Blockbuster served a different type of customer that rented more on impulse and prioritized new releases, and therefore completely ignored Netflix. And some of us might have at the beginning too. So as I think about all of these things, these examples and these business models, as someone who takes her faith very seriously and who also cares deeply about the church, the only way I know how to find deep meaning in this theory is my belief that I serve the perfect disruptor. But not an anarchist disruptor. He was a disruptor who pointed to a coming kingdom that displaces and overthrows earthly paradigms. And I think we can all agree that the disruption I'm talking about has nothing to do with larger profit margins, right? But it is also infinitely more important than bigger buildings, larger worship numbers, or more Sunday schools or small groups. The disruption I'm referring to meets unlikely people in unlikely places and redefines paradigms of living and being. The innovator we serve disrupted an existing market, making what was just for some, for all. Nobody would be excluded from an invitation to the kingdom he brought. No matter your race, ethnicity, gender, social status, influence, no matter your political party, your skin color, your education level, or earthly citizenship, the kingdom that he talked about was like a mustard seed, seemingly insignificant, but would change our spiritual ecosystem forever. And he completely redefined our value systems. He sat at tables with tax collectors, and he healed the unclean. He made the uneducated leaders, and he scorned elite. He rewrote the law and saved an adulteress. He invited a murderer into paradise. In the kingdom, he's bringing the first shall be last and the last first. The weak will be strong and the poor will be rich. You have heard it said, love your neighbor, but Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. He said, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. We serve no ordinary innovator. We serve a disruptor. He challenged religious authority and fearlessly stood against an empire on behalf of an even greater kingdom. He humbled the proud and brought the powerful to their knees. You see, we serve no ordinary innovator. We serve a disruptor who heals on rest days and sleeps through storms, who says that death is mere sleep compared to the power he wields, and the grandeur of faith is childlike, and it's simple. He's a lamb, and he's a lion. He's God and man. He is Alpha and Omega. He is and was and will be. In order for the church to healthily talk about disruptive innovation and how it could help us think about our expression of God's work in the world, we need to remember we serve the ultimate example of a disruptive innovator who changed the world with the message that he was bringing. Again, we're not talking about strategies for increased worship numbers or addressing budget shortfalls. We're not talking about comfortable pews or cozy programming. We're not talking about sanctuary carpet colors or staging for Christmas concerts. We're talking about a message that offended the religious authorities of the time and challenged political rulers. We're talking about the God-man whose death made the earth quake and whose resurrection saved humankind. So again, when we're talking about disruptive innovation tactics and methodologies in relation to the church today, we are not merely influenced by Christian sin and technological advances of our time. We found and ground our discussion and work on the one who came before us and goes before us, Jesus. So I pinned a story for you. We'll unpin it and we'll come back to it now. I asked when Dr. Hardage asked me to be his assistant, and I asked him if he would teach me to lead, he said yes. And he took me to every meeting, and after each one asked me what I thought, genuinely. I wasn't just there to take notes. I wasn't just there to be a fly on the wall. I was there to participate and have a voice. And he, as the executive director, was able to give that pathway to somebody like me. He eventually asked me a question. He said, Elizabeth, if you could do anything with our convention, what would you do? And I spent 6 months thinking about that question and researching and writing. And I came back to him and I selfishly said, I think we need more work in San Antonio. But I had my reasons. I said, we have the highest concentration of Baptist institutions in San Antonio and South Texas than anywhere else in the state. And those institutions are educating, employing, and creating pathways and volunteership for my peers, for my age group. And churches in many ways are struggling to bring those people into their walls. What can we learn from our institutions to begin applying to the ways that we're thinking about the way the convention works? But also, I told them, gosh, I think there are a lot of other young people out there like me, in our Baptist context even, who are sitting at their desks, whether they're in advertising agencies or churches, saying, there's got to be more, right? There's got to be more. It's not out of an anger or a bitterness, but out of a love, a deep love for the Jesus they serve and the church they're part of. There's got to be more, and I want to be part of whatever more is, and I want to find those young people. And so he ended up asking me if I did want to take the position, and I said yes. And so here I am. And so if there's anything about the job that I don't like, it's my own fault. But I came here, and I'm still learning a lot of lessons. And one of the great things that I got to do is drive around the state looking for young people who were asking important questions around the intersections of church and culture from a healthy place, and that were eager and hungry to be part of something bigger than just their thoughts, but a community. They were defining church and pastorship really differently, and some of them had no interest in going to seminary, but wanted to do something that was life-changing for their neighborhoods and communities. Ended up getting to gather some of them and have several times and learning a lot from them. The biggest thing I'm learning is they feel alone, they feel isolated, they feel like there's no pathway into the convention for them necessarily, and that sometimes even inside of their churches they're having a hard time figuring out what it means to have a voice there. One of the things that I also did while I was here, and still am doing, is what secular programs out there are doing this well, and what other denominations are doing this well. I just flew in from Atlanta this morning. I was part of the Texas Methodist Foundation's cohort that they have a grant from Lilly for, where they have taken 2 cohorts of leaders. They call one the center and one the edge. You can guess which one I'm part of. And so I am a part of the Edge cohort, and I am one of only 2 people who aren't Methodists in the entire program. And they said, if we're going to be working on the Edge, then we need other perspectives here. I applied to be part of that because there's nothing like that inside a Baptist context. And I wanted to learn and figure out, what are they doing? How is this helping their pastors and the young leaders of their nonprofits and their parachurch organizations? And then what can we learn from that, and what can we bring here and do for ours too? Because all I'm hearing is they feel isolated and alone and are hungry for mentorship and education. And education may not look like traditional models. So I think that what I've learned in the last about 4.5 years of being in this position is that sometimes what's more necessary than good answers is better questions. The kind of certainty that the church has been accustomed to in many ways now is not entirely useful. The certainty of what it means to be accepted by neighborhoods and communities. Our culture is shaped by confident answers, and yet the future seems to be increasingly uncertain in many ways. We need to step into the unknown. We need to truly walk by faith and not by sight. So I want to close by helping ground the things I've shared today. Because in this amount of time, man, I think I've redone this thing like 30 times. It was hard to figure out what exactly to share in 20 minutes for a really complex theory, but also the simplest and most powerful of messages and how they contend or complement one another. That was hard to do. But thankfully, it's part of a larger vision. this is just the tip of the iceberg in the resources that SABA is going to begin pouring out for you to begin exploring what this means, not just for your church, but what does this mean as individuals? What does this mean as followers of Christ? If I say I believe that I follow the ultimate and the perfect disruptive innovator who brings the perfect disruptive hope to the world, then what does it require of me? There are things that SABA is going to put out that will help, I think, help you and your congregation explore those questions too. So they'll follow with a series of podcasts, as Sammy has already talked about. Dr. Horn is actually going to be putting out early next week an article that he's written as he's poured over Christensen's materials and various other research that he's done to begin applying it to the church as part of the association. I really encourage you to look for that. It probably will be long, but I really encourage you to read it. It will be feature length, which is good. It's a lot. It's a lot of information to be processing. The podcast will give some tangible examples and stories in order to help you catch an imagination for what this will look like in your church. So the topics of the podcast will be things like, what is disruptive innovation again? And is it good or is it bad? Sustained innovation, as I briefly mentioned, versus disruptive. And so they'll dive more into that and what is required of the roles of leaders in your church to live into each of those things, sustained and versus disruptive innovation. A podcast on Jesus as a disruptor, which I'm super excited about. History of the church and disruption. Roles of sustained innovation and disruptive innovation. Again, what roles are necessary? I hope from the story that I told, you see that sometimes there's only the reality is, as a senior pastor or as an executive director of the convention, you can only be so close sometimes to that disruption. Because you're pastoring and you're also living into sustained innovation. And a lot of CEOs face this as well. There's only sometimes a particular proximity you can get to what that is. But the power that you have in creating pathways for those who can is monumental to the future of what it means for young people to pursue their call to follow Jesus as the ultimate disruptor, right? And I am grateful to Dr. Hartage that he saw that and me and allowed himself to craft a pathway for somebody like me. I'm really grateful. That was an aside. Another title will be Disruptor Protocols, Life Cycle of Disruption, and then some highlights of local disruptors. What's going on here in San Antonio right now? What stories can we tell and celebrate? What are we learning? Maybe there's some failures to some of this, and what can we learn from that, and how can we live into that and not be afraid of what that could be? I want to close just with a few personal pondering questions for you to hold inside of you. Gary Patterson's going to come up and give you some others to discuss in small groups, but I just wanted to give you some of these to chew on. What needs to be disrupted in you today as you think through creating pathways for a holy disruption or a disruptive hope in your congregation and community? What needs to be disrupted in you? And to create those pathways. But then what pathways can be created for holy disruptors, for disruption of hope in your church? And then what moments of Jesus' ministry are you leaving with as inspiration today? What teachings, what miracles, what parables, what interactions, what choices are you leaving with as inspiration today? Leave you with those questions for a little bit in silence, and then Gary will come up and share some others with you to discuss. Thank you.